This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. I can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. My name's Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. The most recent book in this series is Animal Activism on and Off the Screen, edited by Claire Parkinson and Lara Henning. Now, I was chatting to Claire by email just this week, and we're really hopeful that we're going to be able to record an episode about the book soon, so watch this space. Now, today's episode's a bit of an unusual one, because it's arisen from a book I read for completely non-academic reasons. I love all things horror, and while I was on holiday in Scotland a few weeks ago, I read a collection of horror stories that my wife Becky had bought for me. I thought it was really great, and I realised both that the topic might be really interesting to an animal studies audience, and that the editor happened to be an academic. So I thought a discussion of this book might make a great episode of Knowing Animals. Today's guest is Zara-Louise Stubbs. Zara is a PhD student at the University of York, where she's reading for a PhD in contemporary literature. Her thesis is entitled Eating Bodies Assembling Selves, the Uncanny Gastronomic in Contemporary Women's Literature. As that title suggests, she's interested in questions around food, the uncanny and gender across a range of literary genres. And today those are exactly the kinds of topics we'll be talking about, as we're going to look at Zara's anthology, The Uncanny Gastronomic, Strange Tales of the Edible Weird, which gathers together a range of short stories and other works, some famous, some comparatively obscure, about the uncanny gastronomic, along with introductions to the text from Zara. The book was published in 2023 as part of the British Library Publishing's series, The British Library Tales of the Weird. Welcome to the podcast, Zara.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Could you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
My undergraduate degree is in literature, but my master's degree is in medical histories and humanities. I've always been really interested in thinking about bodies and how bodies are something that really connects the arts and humanities and the sciences, and kind of thinking of them as almost that perfect bridging point. But my first year of my undergraduate degree, I came across a module called Bodies and Minds. And whilst I was doing that module, I kind of came to the conclusion that food is everywhere, especially in our stories. So to begin with, I noticed this in fairy tales. I speak about this a little bit in the introduction to my book, thinking about how our fairy tales might centre around a bean or a pumpkin or some form of food. But it's also everywhere in our horror. And I would go so far as to say that every genre has its own kind of particular flavour. I got preoccupied with this idea of genre presentation being important and how this reflects our food realities, including things around foodways, ethics, things about mental health relation to food, but also food in relation to consumption and consumerism. And I basically just took it from there. So the idea of food being prescient, but food always being slightly strange.
Good. This slightly strange point is exactly what I was going to ask about. So we might have heard of the idea of the uncanny and Freud, although it might be helpful if you introduce us to that as well. But what specifically is the uncanny gastronomic?
Yeah, so Freud's uncanny is the idea of, the German word for the uncanny is the unheimlich. So the idea of the unhomely, there's something unfamiliar in the familiar. So a lot of people think about that in terms of the domestic, the sight of the home becoming a place of horror. You find that in writers like Shirley Jackson, who are just so happen to be in the collection. But I was interested to think more about the idea of a more embodied uncanny and something that couldn't be more familiar, food, but also couldn't be stranger, also food. So the uncanny gastronomic for me is a literary or artistic mode that highlights or emphasises the already present strangeness that exists at the core of our eating and eating acts. And that usually happens through various techniques. So some writers, I would kind of suggest through this theory, use surrealism to create uncanny gastronomic commentary. Some use horror, some use satire. But the idea that it's not a genre, it's more of a mode or a way of using metaphor to kind of really re-strange what we see as normal consumption.
That's great. And already listeners might be thinking about how this ties to animals in really exciting ways. And I've got a few questions about that in a minute, but let's think about the volume as a whole first. So could you tell us a bit about how you came to the collection of texts that you did? And that's not just stories, but also poetry and even non-fiction.
Yeah, I mean, some of them are there's some horror heavyweights in there. So we've got writers like Edgar Allan Poe, Shirley Jackson, Angela Carter. But we've also got one of my favourite inclusions in the collection, which is an extract from food writer MFK Fisher's book, The Gastronomical Me. I was really keen to show how the uncanny gastronomic manifests in loads of different ways. And we might think about strange food if we think about, things like cannibalism or vampires or eating animals and that kind of sense of the ethics of consumption or monstrous consumption. But I also wanted to highlight the way that the uncanny gastronomic can be a little bit more insidious as well, and how it can kind of manifest in all of these smaller, quieter ways that maybe build up to a kind of a larger violence than we might realise. So that's why I decided to structure the book as a meal. So we begin with an appetizer, which is on human horror. And then we move through to consider supernatural appetites. And here we have some human and more than human hybrids. So we have a werewolf figure, we have Martians, we have wolves, and we have vampires. But we move through that to settle into cannibalism for dessert. But then we end by thinking about the role of human love with food, which I think might be quite unexpected. When we're talking about eating and consumption, we usually think about eating as either something that's being really violent or really extractive. But I really wanted to highlight the ways that food can move and change and work through something that I really like to use, and that's Maud Ellman's idea of food being an omnivorous metaphor, about being able to mean so many things in so many different contexts.
You mentioned Angela Carter. It's hard for me to pick a personal highlight from the volume, but it might be Carter's The Company of Wolves. And this story really, as you were just suggesting, blurs the line between humans and animals, in this case, wolves. And that's something that any scholar of animal studies is going to find interesting. And it's something that's surely central to the gastronomic qualities of this story. So could you tell us a bit about, well, that story, but also others that do this, and how this blurring of human and animal might be important to thinking about the uncanny gastronomic?
Yeah, so we're talking about Angela Carter's story in the collection, which is The Company of Wolves, and that's a story from 1979. So Angela Carter, why I thought of her immediately is that, as I said before, my initial interest in the uncanny gastronomic came from thinking about fairy tales. And Carter is fantastic at kind of reworking those fairy tales. She spoke about exploding bottles and putting them in new forms to kind of create these strange recipes, these strange wines of new fairy tale stories. Something that Carter focused on was taking these folk tales and fairy tales that often had, the big bad wolf, the male figure, the villain, as something that was, number one, indisputably powerful, but number two, kind of something that's indisputably powerful, but also something that's irrevocable. Like it's going to be present. If there's a fairy tale, if it's about eating, if it's about sexuality, you will face off with a wolf or you'll face off with a man. And some of the worst kind of instances in our fairy tale heroines might have to face off with both. But something that Carter was really interested in was thinking about how this could be flipped and thinking about using the second wave of feminism kind of era to think through the image of the wolf, through the image of the male, the eater, and kind of thinking how we can regender in her eyes, sexuality, but from my research, eating and the power of food by allowing appetites to her female characters. And in the 70s, that was probably, for the readers of the 70s, it was a lot more progressive than it feels now. We've got a lot of texts coming out now that, quite interestingly, there's a subgenre about a group of women turning into dogs and eating raw meat. There's quite a few novels that do this. So there's one called Shy Girl, one called The Hounding, and one that I research quite closely called Night Bitch. So this idea of the kind of close connection between the human and the wolf, or the human and the dog, but how these female writers are kind of looking at those through a different lens to think about consumption differently.
It probably wasn't my favourite story, but I was also quite struck by Kafka's The Fasting Artist, and that came in the earlier parts of the book, in which a human ends up on display in a circus alongside animals, but actually seen as kind of lesser than the animals in terms of being a good attraction in the circus. That seemed like another distinctive way that the human-animal divide could be blurred here by the uncanny gastronomic.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think Kafka's hybrids are definitely more of the existential kind. We don't have the kind of blending between body parts, and we don't have these kind of like chimera creatures, but we do have these people who either feel like animals or are treated like them. I mean, we can't talk about this topic without thinking of Gregor Samsa and the Metamorphosis, and the idea that the horror of capitalism can be best represented through not the bureaucrat sick in bed, but the cockroach who takes his place. And the idea that animals, for better or for worse, are this kind of really neat metaphor a lot of the time. The circus was something that Kafka used quite often in his works. There was one text that ends with a character going to join a circus. So it's something that Kafka thought about quite a lot. But I think here, what is interesting to me is the idea of success and the idea of that voyeurism being present in a really uncomfortable way. It's not really until the end that you might kind of see that animal studies link, that you might see him as a mirror. You're thinking, wow, what is he going to do? And thinking, especially because he's called an artist, that's maybe not something that we would allocate to an animal. A lot of the times we see the nature and culture divide, and the fact that Kafka positions this man as an artist, even though he's so animalistic, I find fascinating. It's something I wanted to put in there to kind of show this idea of, I suppose, the monstrous side of non-eating as well, and that idea of abstinence and what that might have meant for Kafka and his contemporaries in an existential sense.
I'm immediately reminded then of Han Kang's The Vegetarian, which again talks about this kind of non-eating as a kind of monstrous thing, and actually doesn't exactly present vegetarianism in a particularly good light.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Han Kang's a really interesting one, because my master's thesis, I wrote quite heavily on that novel, and I think was a really early exploration into the more than human, and I worked on themes about eating and eco-sickness and bodily mutation quite closely together. But yeah, there's this sense that not eating is some kind of form of asceticism. It's some form of kind of reverence. It's seen as quite saintly if we think of things like the starving saints, particularly with medieval mystics. But in the texts that I look at, not eating is also a form of horror. And another great example of that is a story by Carmen Maria Machado in the short story collection Her Body and Other Parties. And why I mention this story is that this lady, who self-describes as fat, has bariatric surgery, but her house is haunted by the flesh that she's lost. But this flesh kind of wanders around in almost a humanoid golem form in the basement of her house, almost begging for affection, like a pet, like an animal. So there's this sense that, that kind of refusal to eat also breeds horror. And that's really important to me when we're looking at kind of global foodways and food realities today, because we deal with that kind of dual epidemic, as a lot of food scientists will say, of malnutrition and obesity. And how can those two things exist together? And the idea that both are a form of excess and both are dangerous and therefore horrifying.
Another way that the Uncanny Gastronomic can animalise humans is by putting them in the position of animals as food for some more powerful being. And it's far from the only example, but Damon Knight's To Serve Man is an obvious case of this, where humans are kind of treated as farm animals, or the whole earth is treated as a farm. So could you tell us a bit about what the Uncanny Gastronomic could perhaps tell us about our farming practices as well as about our eating practices?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the Uncanny Gastronomic is really good at flipping things on its head. And one way it does that is it challenges that idea of human sovereignty and the idea that if we're looking at things through a lens of speciesism, the idea that the human may be, quote unquote, at the top of the food chain, but that's not necessarily always the case. And it also doesn't have to be the case. I think this is part of why the vampire anxiety comes back quite regularly, because it's the idea of the human being unseated by something, and kind of what if there is some kind of form that is more powerful than us, more intelligent than us, has better technology, who can maybe feed themselves straight from our bodies. There's no need to process the food source. That's something that I think is quite intimidating about the vampire on an existential level, is that, we live in a culture where most of our food is processed, even if we don't eat much raw. So we'll cook everything, even plant matter. But the vampire, the fact that it can eat so quickly, it can prey on something and kind of feed itself, nourish itself straight from a source, is something that we're really not used to, and kind of also really represents at the same time that extractive capitalism that industrial agriculture today is kind of built upon. So I think there's a lot of room for critique, and a lot of my wider reading does lie in reading information about agriculture, information about the horrors of things like monocropping, and kind of thinking about what I call food realities. And I've said at lots of different talks now that often I find these food realities much more horrifying than the food fictions. And I think the job of Uncanny Gastronomic fiction is to kind of paint these horrors in a different light so they still resonate with readers, because we're all very aware of some of the issues that are happening in the food system. We know, everyone knows the term free range. We all are aware at some point that, there is death, that there is, you can ask a small child and there is at least some understanding, but the problem is that it's become normalized. So I think the job of this fiction is to defamiliarize what is already strange, and that's such a hard task. But in doing so, I really hope that this kind of fiction and research on this kind of fiction opens people's eyes to kind of the uncanniness of our typical consumption, and to think about the fact that, it may not be as sustainable as we think it may be.
And on that note, I'd really like to prompt you to tell us a bit about Roald Dahl's story, Pig.
Yeah, so Roald Dahl is a really interesting one, because he wrote a poem that's also called The Pig, which is a really interesting combination piece to the story Pig, if you get a chance to read it, because that one's actually told from the pig's perspective, which is a really interesting twist. But this story by Roald Dahl it really plays for me on the idea of Carol Adams' The Absent Referent. So the idea that for food to exist and for us to eat meat, that there is a kind of gap between our understanding of meat and flesh, and how we think of animal protein as meat rather than flesh, and how that kind of distinction allows us to keep some distance from that violence in the kind of the meat industry. But in Pig, we have a character who is really unsure about where his food comes from. And he has a conversation with a waiter who says, "All I can tell you is that I think it was pig's meat." "You mean you're not sure?" "One can never be sure." And I think that for me really highlights this idea that not only are we distanced from the idea of what we're eating, we're also distanced from the reality of it. If you think of things like the horse meat scandal, there's been plastic found in things like Mars bars. The idea that we're so distanced from our food because we don't want to deal with what Diane Perkis called the unprocessed disgusting, that we've actually caused more issues for ourselves because we are so open to subterfuge. We are so open to be fed something that's not what we're told it is. And that could mean that the pig that you're eating is perhaps not pig. And I think that's quite an existential issue for a lot of people. If the idea of eating meat isn't disturbing enough for some people, the idea of not knowing where the meat comes from might be what kind of plants that true horror and kind of establishes a change in behaviour around meat eating. So it's not necessarily the ethics, but the ambiguity.
And do you think that these stories, this encounter with fiction, can have the power to change people's relationships with food, people's attitudes about food, people's approach to food?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, I think something that weird fiction as a genre does really well is it plays on affect, it plays on the body, and it's a genre that I think has a physiological tendency. I genuinely believe that, stories need bodies and food needs bodies, and therefore the two are always going to be really connected. We feel these kind of stories in our stomachs. And I think for that reason, it's really difficult to read stories like these and come away completely unchanged.
Now, Zara, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. And I appreciate that animal studies isn't necessarily your core of your research, even if animals, of course, feed into this. So that's an unfortunate phrase, perhaps. But please feel free to interpret these questions how you see fit. So, can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
I have 2 examples, and I think one of them is fictional, which might surprise some people, but was actually part of an excerpt from Ovid's Metamorphoses. In book 15, there is some work on the teachings of Pythagoras. And obviously in this kind of Ovidian hellscape or heaven or however you want to interpret it, there are lots of animal and human and non-human interactions that kind of really foreground these issues of what is a body, what is a boundary between a body, what is allowed to do with that body, what are other people allowed to do with your body. So I think it's really interesting that within this text, Ovid decided to kind of basically paraphrase the teachings of Pythagoras on vegetarianism and kind of give a little bit of a mini aside to thinking about the ethics of eating flesh. So that's one great example. But I think in a more traditional sense, thinking about non-fiction, I would say some of the works by Donna Haraway and kind of writing by the kind of new material feminists is probably more of a straightforward animal studies route.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
I think I would probably give that to my master's thesis. So the title of that was The Post-Human Pastoral, Ecological Mutation and Bodily Crisis in Contemporary Literature. So in that thesis, I looked at works by Han Kang, so the vegetarian, as we mentioned before, and I also looked at the works of Jeff Vandermeer in the Southern Reach trilogy. I think that's where the seeds of my interest in looking at all of these ecological and species and interspecies connections kind of grew from, and especially thinking of them across genre. In Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation, the first in the trilogy, there are lots of these really strange hybrids. In particular, there is one there's a boar with a human voice. So there's some really great animal content to be ploughed there.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I'd have to give that to Carol Adams.
What's the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Obviously, there is so much, but I think if I was thinking particularly from my field, I think the best thing is to tell their stories. As I said before, we use them as ways to help to tell our stories, but that's a very anthropocentric use of metaphor. And I think giving animals the grace to try and tell their stories, or to even consider what that might look like, is perhaps, from a literary perspective, one of the most important things we could do to make some kind of narrative change into the change the ways that we think about and think through animals.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
To reorient the idea of human sovereignty. So obviously, as we said before, we think of the human as the pinnacle. This is laced in speciesism. But to think of human as one among many rather than sovereign, I think would be really useful. And I also think that would inherently, if we saw animals more as non-human animals, more as peers rather than as food, we would kind of necessarily interrogate our ideas of food and flesh more broadly if we saw them as peers.
What are you working on next?
Well, finishing the thesis is the main thing. I'm aiming to work on food futures in post-2020 literature. There's been some really interesting things that have come out during the height of the COVID pandemic that I'm really interested in looking at in terms of how that's impacted foodways and how we're thinking about how food gets to us, and we're thinking globally in a different way. And I think that has really interesting repercussions for our relationships with agriculture and things like that. So yeah, food futures.
And how can people find out more about your work?
So I have a research profile on the University of York website. So you can find that by searching Zara-Louise Stubbs. I also have a LinkedIn profile with the same name. And you can find me on X at @ZaraStubbs_.
And I should probably say, because nobody can see what I can see right now, that Zara has been joined by a friend who is disrupting her microphone a little bit, and she's being licked an awful lot by what looks to me like a very large dog.
Yeah, we've got a Labrador here.
Well, all welcome on Knowing Animals. Well, thanks so much, Zara and friends, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on X or on Facebook, and you can find me on X or on Instagram or Blue Sky. I'm even on LinkedIn now. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.